Well, Don, I have a question that I'd
Sure.
like you to start with. So, in thinking about the construction of this project and
Mhm.
the desire to improve services and the lives of kids in Western Kansas, how would you introduce narrative into that when working with an individual kid or setting up a particular kind of service?
Okay, so I think part of it would just be allow a child to tell their story from their aspect, and I know this can be difficult at times, but even also hearing the broader family story, and then an acknowledgement. I think that the system itself creates a story for them. It won't be necessarily the story that shapes their entire worldview, but I think that it's important. But then I also think the idea of how communities define who's at risk uh, at times, who's savable at times. Uh, you know, the tail end of the system is incarceration, right? And so we know that depending on the person's underlying crimes or continued behavior, that is the path that the system will ultimately put people in that doesn't, if there isn't some adaptation. But we also know that path is not, that resources aren't equally shared to helping avoid that path. So I can give another example. There was, and it was a very thoughtful conversation I had with a judge after this, but we had a young man that was in our office that had committed a pretty significant person felony and was on the grid to go to the juvenile correctional facility. But the family had resources and they were going to send him to a very costly out of state, and I'm trying not to give too many details here, out of state uh, uh, camp, for lack of a better word, that helped work with juvenile offenders. And so the judge allowed them to do that in lieu of sending him to the correctional facility. And so I had a discussion. I'm like, wow, this seems a little bit unfair that this child gets this chance and there are other kids that I would like to see get the same sort of chance. And the judge would acknowledge that. And he said, yeah, that's 100% true. But am I not to use this chance when I have it, when the time I have it, just because I don't have it with others? And that always kind of stuck with me. And so the ideal world would be shared resources. And so I think when we look at rural communities, this is where the struggle is. We don't have the same number of resources available at times. And I think part of what we're trying to develop that is with this is to develop resources within those communities so children don't have to move out of home. And the other thing, we know this in social work, Betsy, you know this well, for years, decades and decades, social workers have been saying once you move a child out of home, it's much harder to get them back in home than finding resources within their community. And then this is where that important element of identity, you can't develop your identity in a group facility, and to a lesser degree, you can't in a foster home. And so every kid I ever worked with that I had to move out of home wanted to go back home. They would be doing so well sometimes in group, so they always wanted to go back home. And in some cases where you're like, home is not that great, except it is home. And so I think part of that is that you can't develop that identity unless you're in an environment that allows that to happen.
Thank you, Don. Janice, I notice you may have a question.
So, Don, I have a question from a chat. So, what are a few strategies for helping people to challenge or reshape their narratives?
Okay, so I don't want to get too deep in the woods of sort of like the cognitive behavioral triangle, but one of the things is an acknowledgement that your story is not completely shaped external to you, and that you have a chance to shape what your story is and what your identity is. But then also an acknowledgement of that some of it is shaped by your family external events. And so and then this is where hopes and dreams matter a lot, right? What do you want to become? And so I think it starts with a discussion of that. But realize that everybody's life narrative is shaped by actual events that occur, right? You were born, you were removed from home, you had a parent who was deceased, things like that. There's also the responses we have to those events. You know, we can feel emotional pain, etc. But over time, it's the story we want to shape about those events that are important. How does that shape who we become? And, you know, this also relates to that idea of resiliency. And I think your story is an important part of resiliency. Unfortunately, sometimes we think of resiliency as just something people have. This person's resilient, but it is something that can be tapped into. It is something that can be built. And then that's where social support becomes an important part. If the natural support system isn't there, what are the other social supports that people can utilize? You know, next to family, it's teachers. So that's something that really strikes me, and you see this, I see it with my own children, what a loss of support system it is not to have children go to school in this time. And think about that, it's double, right? It's the emotional support of somebody who you know, gives you the good jobs when you do a project, etc. And we also realize it's the other supports, the instrumental supports and expressive supports. The acknowledgement that some children were going to eat less well because they weren't in school should be shocking to Americans if they didn't already know it. And so I know our community and many have rallied around giving out the school lunches that they can pick up, and they also come with breakfast. So there's an example of, so beyond the family structure, integrating social supports.
Greg or Gregory has a question for you.
It's Greg. Thanks. Hey, Don.
Hey, Greg. How you doing?
Hey, your discussion narrative really resonates with some of the work that is happening in communication studies and some of the research that's done in rhetoric and the role of stories in shaping those identities. It also resonates with not only the work in restorative justice, but speaks to the importance of providing spaces for people to share their stories and the role of things like voice and procedural justice, interactional justice, informational justice. And so as I was listening, I was thinking through how important it is for us to create spaces in our different social systems, whether that's in our families, our schools, our communities, for people to interact with each other and to just simply have a chance to listen, and how formative that can be for our different identities.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, the narratives are interesting because they're really micro, meso, and macro. They go from the small, right? We all develop our sense of identity. Whether, I'm not going to get too psychological. Some of it maybe not even fully conscious at times, right? But then the family structure in which we share these stories, obviously any get-together is where they tend to be shared more. And that's also where they come forward over multiple generations. But boy, communities have them as well, even subsets of community. Even when the voices are stomped on, et cetera, there are also other ways in which they develop. And I agree, lots of things do that. Obviously art, cinema, all these elements in which many stories come across that can be different. And, the 90s in which, I started going to college as an undergraduate and watching the system become more punitive was also a time of great art when it looked at some of the difficulties of crime as well. And so I can't help but think that art and these big meso to macro narratives also helped us start to think about our system better. The juvenile justice system is interesting. And in the 90s, when it started becoming more based on an adult model, it's interesting. It had, from a historical perspective, better outcomes than the adult system. So rarely in life do we take a system that's more successful and shape it based on a system that's less successful. Yet the narrative is what happened. The narrative was out of control children, the super predators. So there's one where you could see a giant macro narrative then started shaping our system. Now, I'm fortunate across multiple states, we're seeing that the narrative changed. We got too punitive. We ignored the reality of adolescent development. Okay, we ignored the idea that the juvenile mind isn't fully developed until you're into your mid-20s, et cetera. And I think it is flipped, that we got too punitive, and this is where we're starting to see progress back the other way.